All right. So cognitive development. We talked about Piaget, and we mentioned that teenagers enter a period where they have abstract thought and greater reasoning power. And one of the things that happens with this greater reasoning power is that they tend to notice hypocrisy. They tend to notice inconsistencies. There tends to be more conflict between children and their parents. That should say parents, not patents. They'll say if teenagers get involved with, they experiment. So they might experiment with sex, or they might experiment with drugs or drinking. And then a parent will say, you're too young to smoke, don't smoke. And let's say the parent says that, the kid might say, well, but you smoke. And there's tension because children are trying, or adolescents in particular, are trying to figure out who they are, right? They tend to be more focused on themselves. According to Erickson, they're going through this identity crisis. So they tend to be exploring, but when you try and rein them in, they don't respond well. So parents oftentimes report the teenage years as a period of conflict. Um, there is also a sense of egocentrism. They're different from what Piaget said in cognitive development. This sense of egocentrism is more of a self-absorption, a feeling like nobody gets them, no one's experiencing what they're going through. So there's much more of a spotlight on the self versus other people. It's not that you can't perspective take, it's that you tend to be more self-focused in general. Another piece, which I'm going to introduce you to, is moral development. And moral development, we could have very well taught this earlier, but it makes sense to teach it in adolescence, because that's where, in adolescence, early adulthood, that's where people start to hit the higher levels of morality. So Lawrence Kohlberg wanted to see how we deal with determining right and wrong. And he gave a series of dilemmas to people. And he asked them, well, in this scenario, what the person did, was it right or wrong, and why? And the most popular dilemma that people talk about is what's called the Heinz dilemma. And the Heinz dilemma is as follows. There's this gentleman by the name of Mr. Heinz, and his wife is stricken with a very rare disease. And if she doesn't get medicine or the cure, she's going to die. So Heinz is searching, and he discovers that there's a pharmacist who has the medication, and they're selling this medication for 10 times the cost it is to produce. So Heinz doesn't have the money. He tries to negotiate with the pharmacist. The pharmacist says no. And because he doesn't have the money to pay for it, he chooses to steal it. And the question is, was he right or was he wrong for stealing it, and why? Now, Kohlberg was more interested in the why than whether they were right or wrong, right? So I'm kind of curious, does anyone have a position on Heinz stealing the medicine? Was he right or was he wrong, and why? Anyone want to jump in on that? Okay,
Um,
go ahead.
so I think like the answer could go both ways. I'm just trying to think of like
Well, what do you think? Do you think he was right, or do you think he was wrong?
um well, I think I would do the same thing.
Okay.
So I would say he's right,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not necessarily the right actual course of action because now he's gonna get in legal trouble.
Right.
So
So there is the potential for legal trouble. So you're saying I would do the same thing. but there's now the risk of legal trouble. Okay. Um, anyone have other thoughts on it? Anyone else think he was right? Anyone think he was wrong?
I think he's wrong because stealing is wrong, but it makes sense why he would.
Yeah. So you're not judging him, but you think he's wrong because stealing is inherently wrong.
Yeah.
Gabriel, what do you think?
Oh, honestly, I'm gonna be honest. I would say, yeah, I think he was right, to take it. I mean, like, it's still wrong. It's still morally wrong to steal, but because there is, like a dire, emergency regarding like the wife's death, like I'm a very, and this is just personal to me because I care about family a lot, or at least that's one of my biggest values. So I would definitely understand that, but inherently it is still wrong to steal. So honestly, if I were to actually give an answer, I would say somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Well, in these dilemmas, right, they're called a dilemma because you could create an argument one way or the other, but Kohlberg wouldn't allow you to say somewhere in the middle. You would have to pick whether he's right or wrong and why. So you can't land in the middle.
All
So
right, so then at this point, I would even with like the personal connection of family, I would still have to argue wrong, that it's wrong to steal, So yeah.
now, good. And by no means is this a judgment of anyone in the class, right? Because when Kohlberg created these dilemmas, he knows you're going to land on both sides of the argument. But he was more interested in listening to, okay, well, why did you say it was right? Why did you say it was wrong? What did you add to your answer that's related to morality? And he found that there were three phases of moral development, and each phase has two sub stages, right? So you have pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality. And I'm going to explain each. In pre-conventional morality, which it's a stage theory, so we'll give you ages, but that's less important than the process that's supposed to occur. Pre-conventional morality is usually how we think between birth and 9 years old, and the determination of right or wrong is based on reward and punishment, right? So stage one is, oh, it's wrong because I'm going to get in trouble, or it's wrong because he's going to get in trouble. Stage two is, you know, if you, it's based on reciprocity. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But if you don't scratch my back, I'm not scratching yours, right? So it's kind of reciprocity because, and you might hear arguments that because the pharmacist was charging 10 times the cost, it was right because he wasn't open to negotiation with Heinz. He wasn't willing to uh, allow him to pay it out. He just said, no, this is the cost. And Mr. Heinz did not actually have that, right? So because it was overpriced, yes, it's okay, right? That would be the argument towards reciprocity. Conventional morality is based on the rules of society. So instead of just the consequences, it's what society thinks is right or wrong. So stage three is oftentimes referred to as the good girl, nice boy orientation, which is seeking the approval of others. So the approval of one's parents. So if someone said no, he shouldn't steal it because his family's going to be upset with him because he stole it, right? So that would be seeking the approval of others. Stage four would be towards rules of authority. And this is what we refer to as a law and order orientation. And one of your peers said that well, I would do it, but now he's up against legal troubles, right? So that's stage 4, recognizing you shouldn't steal because the law says you shouldn't steal, right? Um, Stage 5 is called post-conventional morality. This is where you think beyond what society says. So you're coming to your own understanding of morality, of what's right or wrong, and it's independent of necessarily what society says is right or wrong. So the social contract orientation is stage 5, which is the laws or rules are designed to ensure the greater good. So some people might use the argument, yes, it's okay to steal because while he's going to go to jail, it's more important to save a life. So the emphasis on saving a life takes priority over the laws of society, right? So that would be a stage 5 orientation. And then stage 6 is a universal principle of morality that's unique to you. So someone in this class also used this argument, which is it's wrong for him to steal because it's inherently wrong to steal, full stop, right? And while that seems like it's not giving depth, it is. That's at the core of the person who feels it's morally wrong, right? So there were these different stages. Now, one of the things that Kohlberg did was he did research studies and normed it initially in men, right? So his original studies were using men, and then he applied the principles of his theory to men and women. And when he applied it to men and women, women tended to, on average, land at a lower stage of morality. And Carol Gilligan, which was actually a colleague of Kohlberg, she was bothered by this. And she said this post-conventional component of morality is flawed because the dilemmas that Hines used were based on a justice orientation, which skews in favor of males. Males tend to have higher emphasis on justice. Females have more emphasis on average, on caring and compassion. So it's going to result in different kinds of responses. And Gilligan said, because males and females use different perspective on moral issues, and they might even be raised or conditioned to think differently about morality, it's a flaw. So she rejected his idea of moral development, and she said if you would have had compassion-based dilemmas, where the question is, was this compassionate? Was this caring? The results would have been quite different. So that's a criticism. Now, another criticism is that the dilemmas, if you run Kohlberg's principles in other parts of the world, the results, you don't see as much of the post-conventional morality, especially in non-Western societies. So there's also a bias related to culture and where people are native to. So there are other criticisms of Kohlberg, and that's a big criticism if it has a gender bias, if it has a culture bias. Then you could argue, hey, wait a minute, I thought stage theories were supposed to be universal, and the data is suggesting they're not universal. So while we teach Kohlberg and it is a good framework, I also want you to understand the criticisms of Goldberg and what he says. All right, so That's our cognitive piece, right? So we talked about how teenagers think, how they view themselves, right? And how they come to some sense of morality.